All right, howdy folks. Farmer Devin here, sitting by the fire in the shop, doing a little bit of winter work right now, and I just wanted to capture a little bit of what I was doing on camera, get it on video. So I'm going through some of the hives. It's one of my projects for the winter. I've got a lot to do. You can kind of see stacks, and there's the finger, stacks upon stacks upon stacks upon stacks of boxes. So I've got to go through them all, kind of sanitize them, go through the frames, make sure they're solid, good to go, ready to be workable for the summer. The majority of these boxes, I'm just getting them revamped, and they're going to remain Langstroth hives, and hopefully get some bees in them over the coming years. I'm not going to be able to get quite enough bees to use all these boxes this summer, but I'm hoping to get a good chunk of them out of the shop this year. What I am doing, I'm doing probably 2, possibly 3 or 4, but most likely there's 2 of these Layens conversions. So Layens hives are, sorry, I'm going to shut that off. And we're back. Okay, Layens hives are essentially a deeper hive that's a little more well insulated. And the idea is that it's a little bit better for the bees. There's a few key differences in the way that they're managed, the way that they're built. So as suggested, mentioned, there's more insulation on Layens typically. So I'll show you the thickness of these Langstroths here. You can see, if I turn this camera, they are just barely about as thick as the finger. So a Layens hive is typically going to be 2, maybe 3 fingers thick. It's much thicker wood. Usually there's air gap for insulation, things like that. When you do a Langstroth Layens conversion, I watched a guy do this, and he essentially added these pieces of plywood here like I've done, and then there's a few things I did that's a little different, so I guess I'll point back in here and get some of these frames out of the way. So one of the things that I did that's different is I added some paper. Hopefully you can see it in the hive here, stapled some paper along the edge. And that was mostly just to cover up the space from the top part of that bottom box. So there's this section here where the wood is thinner, and so that space right there would have been less insulated. So I just added that. I don't know if it'll even last with the bees in there. And then the other thing that was different, I saw some guys converting these, and for whatever reason, they made shorter frames that went widthwise across these Langstroths, and I think that was probably because the Layens extractors are built for frames of that size. I'm not really too concerned about that. My plan with this is that this main box is going to be just for the bees. I'm going to manage it similar to the way I do the Langstroth, so I'm not really planning to ever harvest honey off of these frames. You know, I may harvest wax at some point as I clean them up and replace them, but I don't really need an extractor for that. So I'm not too concerned about the way that it's designed lengthwise. So, all right, we covered the insulation. You can see that I added some plywood and made this just a little more insulated. The other key difference there is these longer, more complete frames. So a Langstroth frame, pull one of these real quick, that has some wax on it. I'm going to lean it against this other one, and then we'll show the camera. So the shorter one here is a Langstroth frame. It's typically designed to go in the width of one of these deep boxes, and you'll have 2 of these boxes stacked on a hive, a healthy hive here in Wyoming, and you'll just keep that amount of bees there. The problem with that, health-wise for the bees, is this dropping frames. The gap between the 2 separate frames in those boxes. So in the winter, when the bees are balled up and keeping themselves all warm for the winter, that ball moves up through the hive over the course of the winter as it consumes some of the sugars and just over-winterizes, right? When you have that gap in between the 2 frames, what you might run into is that the bees run out of food on the bottom frame, but it's too cold for them to really want to move up to that top frame. And that might last for a couple days to a week or 2. That period of time, my thumb's in the way, that period of time can cause some stress on the bees, essentially, so it's a little harder on them. So The Layens Hive kind of solves that problem by having one contiguous frame down the height, so that when those bees are winterized in the center, that ball of bees can move up uninterrupted throughout the winter. So that's kind of the advantage there. Other than that, differences in management. So with your Langstroth hives, you're regularly going to be taking these 2 boxes apart. I typically myself only do that in the spring, in which case I will flip the boxes, so the box that is on the top will go to the bottom and vice versa. With the Layens, you don't ever really move the boxes. They're designed to work with the frame only, much like a top bar hive. So I've gone from 10 frames to a box down to 9 frames here, and they're full length. And these frames are all they're going to be handling in this box. And that will be a difference there. So I won't have to like pull the hive apart into pieces, which means a little bit less interruption for the bees. Furthermore, I've noticed that a lot of the Layens guys, for one reason or another, they have a blanket or a board or some sort of covering over the top of the frames whenever they open the top of the hive. And what that does essentially is it keeps all of the bees in the dark and unstressed by light exposure, except for the frame that they're currently working on. So I'm probably going to be playing with that as well as I develop this hive. I basically just have to get another bottom board and then a top, and probably figure out that light cover thing. Pretty simple, and of course by keeping it the same length as these Langstroth hives, I didn't have to completely build new frame parts all from scratch. I did have to make these long horizontal or long vertical bars from scratch. I was able to just cut those up with the table saw and kind of work that out today. And then I'm going to show you here in a second. I got the compressor turned off, so I got enough air. I should be able to do the last 2 frames here. But the way that I'm attaching these are the same Langstroth foundations. I've seen some people turn these foundations just vertically on a Layens frame, and that'll work, but if you can get close enough here with the camera without it losing focus, you notice how those hexagons are pointed upwards. When you rotate, then the hexagons aren't pointed upwards anymore. It changes the orientation of the cone. And so the bees, probably prefer it a certain way. I'm assuming that the manufacturers have spent enough time studying that it's that way for a reason. So essentially, what I'm doing in order to attach these, there's a slot on the top and bottom bar for Langstroth frames, and I'm using those to my advantage. So I'm just sinking a single brad through the top bar that's holding this frame, hanging it, and then I'm using 4 brads on the side, on each side, to essentially sandwich the frame in between those 2 brads, and that prevents it from falling out one direction or the other. And that should be sufficient for the bees to work it. And the only thing I'm going to have to do after this is just coat everything in wax, so it should be good to go. Anyway, there's about a 9-minute video just to show you essentially what I'm doing for a winter project here, what I've got torn apart here in the beehive, in the shop with all the hives. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of my dust pile here from the sawdust. There's the thumb way over there. Anyway, from cutting up all those chunks today. Anyway, hope you are having a good New Year. By the time you're watching this, it's close to New Year's Eve. I might get this published before then. And I hope you had a good Christmas and time with your family. Anyway, regardless, thank you for watching, and hope you continue watching for all the exciting stuff coming up in 2026.